So going along with Chapter 5 that we already discussed there, with the Indians, now with them gone, we need to talk about the farmers and also populism. Now, the first one here is encouraging people to move west. Now, with the Indians out of the way, people could feel free to basically move into these lands and do things as they wished. So, again, I'm going to mention it. We've already talked about it, but the Homestead Act encouraged people to move west for free land. Now, it was not, as they got there, the most desirable land. So they needed people who were going to be rough and tough because a lot of the men who went here actually died. And this is actually going to spur, if you will, women's rights. Women's rights really kind of focused in the West because the men were dying off due to this hard work, and it became ever more present. The women took their places. Now, the railroad comes into play here as well. We have a major railroad built called the Transcontinental Railroad. Transcontinental Railroad is exactly what it says. The prefix trans means across what? The continent. So the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific will join up at a place called Promontory Point, Utah, and they're going to drive a golden spike to commemorate this. Now this is such a big deal because now the cattle and things raised in the West can be sent to the industrial centers in the East and the packing plants in Chicago and all these different things. And so this really changes the game as far as people are concerned. And from there, we want to build more railroads and connect more land. And we'll get that maybe in industrialization that kind of comes out. Maybe here, depends on. Now, how do you get people to build railroads? Number one, really dangerous. All right, so they're going to use cheap labor. They're going to use a lot of Chinese immigrants, as well as a lot of Irish immigrants and some former slaves and different things like that. Why? This is going to seem very mean, but they were seen as disposable. So if they died, which the chance of dying on a railroad was very high, you could find some others. So how do you convince people to build railroads? The government offers what is called subsidies. You may have heard the word subsidized housing or things like that. A subsidy is exactly what you see there. It's a cash or it's a tax break for anyone who participates in an industry that's sponsored. A big subsidy has been going around to cities now to put in Wi-Fi, to put in these fiber optic cables or whatnot. So the subsidy at this time was railroads. And so you had people who are carpenters building railroads, and people who are owning hardware stores, and people who are just all these different occupations. They have no idea what they're doing. Their whole goal is to just build it so they can get their money. Okay? And the government comes out okay because you have land of track. So that is a subsidy. Now, as we're moving west, and innovators come up. Who? Well, you kind of recognize the first one, right? The yellow and the green. John Deere is going to mass produce these huge tractors. As well, a man named Cyrus McCormick is going to make something called a reaper. You may have heard of the Grim Reaper before. He has something in his hand, and that is called a sickle or a scythe, and that is used to kind of chop down the grain, and so you can harvest it. Now, the McCormick Reaper is going to do the job of 10 men. So what does this mean? All these people went west to farm. But if you're making more machinery, do you need more or less farmers? Answer, you need less. So there's less work to be done, and there's all these people, and that's all they know how to do. And that's going to present a major problem that we're going to see here in a second. People start losing jobs and crops and things like that. Now, the government steps in as well. There's something called the Morrill Act. Now, the Morrill Act, you can see it there, land grant universities. If you've ever heard of a school that was called an A&M, Texas A&M, Florida A&M, those are the big ones. Did Mississippi have one? Absolutely. It's now called Mississippi State. So a lot of schools, a lot of states now call them state universities, Oregon State, Alabama State, etc. You go there, and because originally they were called A&M schools, stands for Agricultural and Manufacturing. Whole purpose was to make something productive of the land. Okay? So there you go. Now the next one we have was called the Hatch Act. Now you see that Senator Hatch is hatched out of the eggs here, right? The Hatch Act is for um, agricultural experimentation. Now, this is a big thing coming forth because a lot of food now is produced in a way called GMO, which basically stands for genetically manufactured organism. The corn you're eating is not made in a field, it's made in a lab. And so that's what a GMO is. And without the Hatch Act, that would not be possible. And they experiment on low light and different conditions to see how these things grow. Really cool stuff. You might not care so, but what are you eating? Now, here's where we get into problem, right? So we said we don't need farmers, right? So farmer debt, as you can see, many farmers are struggling. The crop prices went down and the debt went up. Now, mortgages are being foreclosed by the banks. That means their farms are being taken from them because there's no place to work. This poses what we call the dilemma of the farmer. They decide, I'm going to act. Now, the dilemma of middle class is what we have now. So let's say there's a single mom, three kids, working very hard if they're at their job. And there's not enough food coming in on the table. So the parent has an idea. I'm going to work harder. So what they do is they go and get a part-time job, maybe a nighttime job, etc. Now, how does that come out in the end? The more money you make, the higher taxes you actually go out. And so, are you making any more money? Not really. Do you like that? The camera even moved. I shook my head. No, I like that. That was cool. Now, the dilemma farmer is the same thing. The farmer said, hey, I'm losing my job, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore sound science on how to grow crops, and I'm going to make more. Because if I make more crops, that's more money. But if you do that, two things arise. Number one, you overtax. You overproduce the ground. You've got to give rest, and you have to use crop rotation and things like that. Otherwise, the ground's going to dry up, and nothing will grow there. And this produces something later on in the 1920s we call the Dust Bowl. This is kind of the beginning, and it gets worse later on, but we'll get back to that. Number two, if you have too much of something, it creates a surplus in economic terms, and if you have a lot of something, it's worth less. Now, what I mean by that, if you follow, let's say, shoes, for example, people want the newest Jordans or things like that. Now, the most expensive Jordans are the older ones. Why? There's less of them. So the less you have of something, it makes it rare, it makes it scarce, it makes it more valuable. The more you have of something, it's basically like, everybody's got it. So the farmers, in an effort to make more money, actually produced less money for them. That is the dilemma of the farmer. Now, the last straw. What do you do at this point? Who do you help out? As we saw, the U.S. government really made a change because we had been an agrarian society. The South was agrarian, meaning lots of farmers. Now we have the industry, the big industry of railroads, right? Now, they come at a head because the railroads are actually taxing the farmers for living near the lines and different things like that. So there begins to be an appeal, and there's a big circumstance out in Muscle Slough, which is in California. We'll talk about that in class and look at that, in which people are killed because the government's called in to settle a dispute between farmers and railroad tycoons. So who do they side with? They side with the railroads. Why? Money. That's what it's about. Now, a very famous person named Frank Norris is going to produce a book called The Octopus, and this was the early drawing of the octopus. Now, the octopus has become synonymous with the idea of capitalist greed and the whole idea of monopolies later on, but this is where it was born out of. And so, again, why did they side with railroads? Because they made the money.